Now, as we go through this chapter this morning, keep in mind that for the last 2 years, the Apostle Paul has spent those past 2 years locked up in a Roman prison cell, right? And so now after 2 years, all of a sudden, finally, Paul says, I appeal to Caesar. He's saying, you know what? I appeal to the highest court. He's saying, you know what? I'm taking my case to the Supreme Court. And listen, I think in many ways, this passage is very relevant for us today. Because I don't know if you realize this, but we are now living in a day where Christians in America are being hauled off to courts, being thrown into jails, being bullied, and being slandered by those who preach a message of quote-unquote tolerance. And yet nowadays, many of us as Christians, we're silent and we're afraid to speak up, and we don't want to offend anybody. We don't want to rock the boat. In fact, there are many Christian leaders and Christian pastors who are encouraging people to be silent about their faith and to be silent in the workplace, causing one news commentator, Todd Starnes, to say, these days, some churches resemble the cowardly lion more than they resemble the Lion of Judah. Now think about that. The cowardly lion. I'm not afraid, scared of you. But we see this morning in this chapter that the Apostle Paul had the courage to stand, but the question is, do we have the courage to stand? The Apostle Paul had the courage to stand for his faith, even if that meant standing before Caesar himself, appealing to Caesar. And so now as we go back to verse 1, we see that there's this group with an agenda, a group with an agenda. And so in verse 1 it says, now when Festus... Now, by the way, is there anybody else in this room as old as I am? I mean, I cannot read this verse without picturing Festus from Gunsmoke. Who's with me? Well, okay, Marshall Dillon. You know, anyway, so it's my word. Look, if you're young, Google it. It's true. Now, when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews, the chief men of the Jews, informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking for a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem while they laid in ambush along the road to kill him. And so now this passage opens with really a transition in leadership. A transition in leadership, because if you remember, chapter 24, we saw that Felix was the governor of Judah. But now as we come into this chapter, we see that Felix is out and Festus is in. And so it's no longer fix-it Felix, it's now Festus for the rest of us. And so there's this transition in leadership. Now, remember, we saw a couple of weeks ago that Felix was this absolute corrupt politician. In fact, he was a slave who had become the governor of Judah. And that happened, of course, because he had friends in high places, as opposed to Garth Brooks, who has friends in low places. And so he had friends in high places. Remember that Felix and his brother, they were childhood friends with Caesar. And so they call in some favors. Caesar not only sets him free as a slave, but also gives Felix a job. He gives him the position of governor of Judah. But as a former slave, he was abusing his power. In fact, his reign was filled with rumors of murder and sex scandals. In fact, this was a man that history tells us was a womanizer, left a whole string of women in his wake. His original name in the Greek is pronounced Matt Lauer, as we said. Sorry. But this was a womanizer, and he was abusing his power. But his abuse of power and his corruption finally caught up to him, because ultimately he was let go. He was recalled by Caesar. Caesar fired him and removed him from office. And so now Festus replaces him this morning. Now, Festus was a much older and much more regal leader. In fact, the history books tell us that Festus at this point was 70 years old. And he would reign as the governor of Judah for the next 2 years until he died in office. But keep in mind that for the past 2 years, the Apostle Paul had been in Felix's custody. He had been in Felix's prison. And yet Felix knew that Paul was innocent. He knew that the charges were false. And he knew that the Jews were plotting against him. And yet, rather than set Paul free, instead he kept Paul in that prison for 2 years. And we saw last time how over and over again he would summon Paul and bring Paul out of his prison cell and have him stand before his throne. And he would listen to the Apostle Paul preach the gospel. But then when it came time to make a decision about Christ, we saw that he kept procrastinating. He would keep saying things like go away for now. And when it's a more convenient time, I'll call for you. Well, that more convenient time never came. And ultimately, Caesar removed him from office, and Felix lived out the rest of his days in absolute disgrace. And so now this morning, we're reading about his replacement, Festus. Now, Festus, by the way, had a reputation of being a fair and reasonable leader. And this, by the way, was what the Jews were counting on. You see, the Jews were hoping that perhaps this change in leadership would finally give them a chance to put an end to Paul, to finish off Paul once and for all. You might remember that 2 years before this, they had basically hired 40 hitmen, 40 assassins to ambush Paul and assassinate Paul. But ultimately, their plan was thwarted because God had an inside man, and that inside man was Paul's nephew. And so Paul's nephew blows the whistle, and the plan's discovered. Well, now, even though that was 2 years ago, that does not mean that they have forgotten about Paul, and that does not mean that they forgot about their plans to get rid of Paul. And so now, 2 years later, we see that the same plan in action. 2 years later, they still have the same agenda, and that is to set this trap and to try to ambush him and kill him as he's traveling on the road, as he's being sent from Caesarea down to Jerusalem. And so they still have this agenda. And by the way, we should keep in mind that the Apostle Paul's only crime was preaching the gospel. His only crime was proclaiming Jesus Christ. And so the Jewish leaders, they come to the new governor, Festus, and they're like, "Sir, we know that Felix must have left you quite a mess to clean up, and I'm sure you got your hands full. So if there's anything we can do to help, if there's any way we can make your transition into office just a little smoother, you just let us know. We're here to help. Oh, by the way, there was this one case that we gave to Felix a couple years ago, but he was so busy, he never got around to it. Tell you what, why don't you give that case back to us? It's ours anyway, and we'd be happy to help you out. We'd be happy to take that off your hands for you." And so Festus, he obviously realizes that they're up to something. This is an agenda. They have a hidden agenda. And can I just say to you that in the same way, just as they had a hidden agenda, they were wanting to ambush the Apostle Paul, in the same way, listen, we are living in a day that if you're a Christian, that if you name the name of Jesus Christ in your life, you might discover that there are some who have a hidden agenda against you. That there are some today that have a hidden agenda. For example, I told you a couple of months ago about a tech billionaire turned LGBT activist by the name of Tim Gill. And in a recent interview in Rolling Stone magazine, Tim Gill says he quote, wants to punish Christians who do not want to participate in same-sex weddings. Now, for more than 2 decades, this software programmer poured an estimated $422 million into various gay rights causes until 2015. And then once in 2015, once the Supreme Court of the United States legalized same-sex marriage, now Tim Gill is turning all his financial resources towards targeting Christians. Or as he put it in the interview, towards punishing the quote-unquote wicked. And so you need to know that just as there was this agenda against the Apostle Paul, there is an agenda today against those who would boldly stand for the things of Christ. And so now, as we pick it up in verse 4, we see that Paul now becomes public enemy number 1. Public enemy number 1. Verse 4, but Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore, he said, Let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there's any fault in him. And when he had remained among them for more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting in the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. And when he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. Now, that's the key. They couldn't prove any of these charges. These were trumped up charges. These were false accusations. None of them could be proved. Proved? Proven. I don't know, hooked on phonics didn't work for me. And so, again, the leaders of the Jews, they're like, hey, why don't you just do us a solid? Send Paul our way. We let us take Paul off your hands. We'd be happy to deal with this for you. Besides, you're so busy that you don't have the time to deal with our little old problems. Why don't you let us clean this up? And so clearly, Festus is able to see that they have an agenda, that they're up to something. And so he senses this, and he says, no, you know what? If you want to try him, if you want to convict him, if you want to prosecute him, you need to come up to my courtroom in Caesarea to do that. And so, being a seasoned politician, at least Festus was savvy enough to see through their plot, to see through their agenda. But isn't it interesting, by the way, that he never once asked what Paul was accused of? He never asked what the charges against him were. He never asked what the evidence was against him. He never asked any questions. I mean, because if he would have asked some of these questions, then certainly he would have seen, he would have discovered that the only crime, as we said, that Paul was guilty of was preaching the gospel. In fact, if he would have asked enough questions, he might have discovered that the truth of the matter is that wherever the Apostle Paul went, there was this group, the Bible says, called the Judaizers that would follow Paul wherever he went. They would dog his steps, and they would cause trouble, and they would spark these riots. And he might have discovered that this group, they were constantly looking for dirt on Paul and looking for anything they could accuse him of, and that this group followed Paul to Jerusalem. And then falsely accused him of bringing a Gentile into the temple. Now, of course, Paul did not do that. And so they accuse him of this, and they stir up this riot. They stir up this mob, and now this mob is wanting to rip Paul from limb to limb. And that's when the Roman guards came in. That's when the soldiers came in. But then ultimately, they arrested Paul. And so if Festus would have investigated, he would have discovered that Paul was in this situation. Paul was standing on trial because there was a group with an agenda that was targeting him. A group with an agenda that was targeting him. And by the way, can I just say to you that if you're a Christian, if you name the name of Jesus Christ, if you're born again, then listen, you need to realize that you might be a target as well. I mean, does anyone remember what Jesus said? Jesus said, as they persecuted me, they will persecute you. Now listen, I looked that up in the Greek. You know what it means? It means they will persecute you. It's a guarantee. It's not like a guess. He's saying, if you're doing the Lord's work, you'll have the Lord's enemies. It's kind of like that old Far Side cartoon from years ago, where you have two deer that are talking to each other, and one's got this big bullseye on his chest, and the other looks at him and says, bummer of a birthmark, Ralph. I'm sorry, Hal, I think his name was? Yeah, Hal. But can I just say to you that you know what? If you're born again, if you're a Christian, that's your birthmark. You have a target on you. In fact, listen, I don't know if you've noticed, but in the last 10 years, more American Christians have been targeted in like never before in this country. For example, back in 2015, a Baptist flower shop owner became Washington State's public enemy number one. 72-year-old Baronelli Stutzman. As a Christian, she's opposed to same-sex marriage. And so a Washington judge, however, ruled that she violated the law when she refused to provide flowers for a same-sex wedding. Now, listen, in the end, this could have cost her not only her business, but her life savings and even her home. Now, the judge at that time said this. Judge Alex Ekstrom said, quote, while religious beliefs are protected by the First Amendment, actions actions based upon those beliefs are not necessarily protected. In other words, he's saying, it's okay to believe in God just as long as you don't put your belief into action. It's okay to have faith in God as long as you're not actually living that faith. Or how about this? Last year, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, after 75 years of being on campus, they've now decided to sue Wayne State University in Michigan. Now listen to this. The Christian club is suing the university because they felt like their rights are being violated, and so they're going to stand for their rights, even if that means that they have to sue, even if that means they have to take them to court, even if that means they have to appeal to Caesar. And so what happened? Well, the university unconstitutionally derecognized this group and kicked them off the campus. Why? Well, because this group, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, has said that if you want to be a leader in their group, you have to be a Christian. To be a Christian, to lead a Christian group. Wow. And so they said, because you don't want non-Christians to be leaders in your group, you have to leave our campus. Now, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship said that, it doesn't matter what you believe. You can believe anything and be a member of our group. You don't have to believe in Jesus. You can believe in Santa Claus. You can believe in Buddha. You can believe in the Easter Bunny. Believe in whatever you want to believe. You can have any lifestyle. You can be a member of our group. But if you want to be a leader in our group, well, then you've got to be a Christian. Then you've got to profess faith in Christ. And because of that, they were kicked off the campus. Or how about this? Last year in California, a Christian mother by the name of Christina Zavalis would slip little Bible verses and encouraging notes into her 7-year-old son's sack lunch bag. And so at lunchtime, he'd pull those out and he'd read them. And pretty soon his friends were asking him, what those notes were. So then he would read them aloud to his friends. And pretty soon, many of his friends were requesting and asking if they could have copies of that. So pretty soon, his mom would make several copies of those Bible verses and put them in his lunch so that he could distribute those and give those out to his friends. That is until one day, the school ordered him to stop handing out Bible verses on school campus. In fact, one day suddenly, a sheriff's deputy, an armed sheriff's deputy shows up at the little boy's home, and when the little boy opens the door, the sheriff's deputy tells him that what he's doing is illegal, tells him that he has to stop handing out Bible verses. It's against the law. He's 7. All that to say that just as they targeted Paul, don't be surprised if they target you. Just as the Apostle Paul became public enemy number 1 and there was a target on his back, I'm here to tell you that in this culture, the way this culture is right now, if you are bold for your faith, there might be a target on your back. Maybe on your chest, maybe on your head. I'm not sure, but there will be a target. And so Paul discovers that there are those with an agenda. He discovers he's public enemy number 1. But now as we pick it up in verse 8, he also discovers that Festus was a biased judge with his own agenda. He had his own agenda. Verse 8. And while he answered for himself, Paul said, "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended anything at all." But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things?" And so here's where Paul now discovers that Festus was anything but unbiased. This is where Paul discovers that Festus had his own hidden agenda. As it says that Festus wanted to do the Jews a favor, so he asked Paul to go to Jerusalem. And so we read this and we're like, what's that all about? I mean, why would this new governor, Festus, want to do the Jews a favor? Why does he want to do them a solid? Well, keep in mind the political climate right now. Keep in mind, as we said, that Festus was sent there for a reason. Why was Festus sent there? 2 words: damage control. He was sent there for cleanup duty, right? Because think about it. He was sent there because Caesar had grown tired of Felix's antics. In fact, here's the very last thing that happened when Felix was in office. The very last thing that Felix did was, in fact, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. The last thing that happened was there was this huge riot between the Greeks and the Jews. This huge riot that broke out. Now, behind the scenes, what had really happened was that Felix was frustrated with the Jews. And so he had ordered the Greeks to publicly beat and attack Jewish men, and then also publicly rape and attack Jewish women, and then steal their possessions. So now word of this gets back to Caesar, and Caesar realizes he has no choice but to fire this guy, but to remove him from office. So now with that context in mind, obviously the last thing Festus, the new guy, the last thing Festus wants is for the Jews to get upset. The last thing he wants is for another riot to break out. And so what we have here is a man who's pretty much willing to do anything to appease the Jews. Anything to pacify the Jews and make them happy. And this is why it says that he wanted to do them a favor. In fact, one Bible commentator suggests that Festus was probably aware of the assassination plot against Paul. He was probably aware of the fact that they, when they say, hey, can you send Paul down to us to Jerusalem, that they had people hiding out on the road that were going to ambush. And that maybe Festus knew about that, and that perhaps from Festus' perspective, perhaps it was a kind of a win-win situation. Because on the one hand, he would appease the Jews, he would make the Jews happy, but on the other hand, he would get Paul off of his hands. He'd be like, oh, that's too bad that he got killed. I didn't even see that coming. I gave the guy a choice. I told him, hey, you could choose to go down to Jerusalem, or you could choose to stay up here in my court. He chose poorly. He just made the wrong choice. And so now Paul discovers that Festus has his own agenda, and that's why, as we pick it up in verses 10 through 12, that Paul now is appealing to Caesar. Verse 10, so Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I've done nothing wrong, as you very well know. For if I am an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there's nothing in these things which these men accuse me of, then no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered and said, you have appealed to Caesar, and so to Caesar you shall go. Now again, as we said at the beginning, by appealing to Caesar, he was appealing to the highest court. He was appealing, if you would, to the Supreme Court. Now you have to understand that Nero, who was the emperor of Rome, the Caesar of Rome at that time, Nero was an absolute corrupt ruler. In fact, there were rumors that he had murdered his own mother and several of his own cousins because he was paranoid and thought they were trying to make a move for his throne. So he murdered them. And then in the year of AD 64, there was this huge fire that broke out in the city of Rome, and it burned and destroyed most of the city of Rome. Now, it was believed that Nero had gone mad. He'd gone insane. He snapped, and in a moment of insanity, that Nero was the one who actually started the blaze himself. And he did it just because he wanted to watch it burn. He was just crazy. He just wanted to watch something on fire. But then all of a sudden he comes to it. He snaps and he comes to it and he realizes how upset the public is. And so in that moment, he then shifts all the blame to Christians. And he says the Christians were the ones who started the fire. After all, they call themselves the light of the world. They were the ones. And so just as Hitler was able to shift the focus to the Jews, Nero started to shift the focus to Christians. And in that moment, he began an all-out government-sponsored assault on Christianity, killing Christians by the hundreds and thousands. And he would use Christians, he would burn them alive and use them as human torches to light up his circus races. He found all kinds of creative ways to torture them until they slowly died. And he did this until the year of AD 68 when he eventually committed suicide. Now, all that's to say simply that when Paul appealed to Caesar, when Paul is appealing to a higher court, when Paul is appealing to the Supreme Court, you have to understand this was not exactly a Christian-friendly Supreme Court we're talking about. And so we wonder, why in the world would Paul appeal to Caesar? Why would he appeal to this guy? I mean, this guy's nuts. This guy's destroying Christians and slaughtering Christians. And Paul's appealing to him? Why? Answer, because that's what God called him to do. Does anybody else remember the call on the Apostle Paul's life? We've talked about this a number of times. Acts chapter 9, verse 15. Acts chapter 9, verse 15, Jesus, speaking of Paul, says this. He says, "This man is my chosen instrument to carry my name before the Gentiles and before their kings and before the people of Israel." And so when you look at the life and the ministry of the Apostle Paul, did he preach the gospel to the Jews? Did he preach the gospel to the nation of Israel? Yes, he did. Did he preach the gospel to the Gentiles? Yes, he did. But what about to kings? Well, so far, no kings. And this is why he must stand before Caesar, the king. But listen, when he finally has his opportunity to stand before Caesar, he doesn't plead his own cause, he pleads the cause of Christ. Because you see, for Paul, this wasn't about saving himself. This was about preaching the gospel. This was not about saving his own skin. It was about saving souls. And now in the same way, let me just say that in the times in which you and I live, in the times in which we live, as those who name the name of Jesus Christ over their lives are being targeted and being bullied and being threatened, I've got to tell you that nevertheless, I am encouraged. I'm encouraged by those today that are just as bold for Christ as the Apostle Paul was in his day. In fact, let me tell you the tale of two coaches. Coach number one is Joe Kennedy, of Bremerton High School, who took a knee to honor God. The other is Coach Joey Thomas of Garfield High School, who took a knee to protest the United States of America. Now, Coach Thomas made national headlines back in September of 2016 after he joined the entire football team in protest against the United States during the national anthem. Now, at that time, the school district that they were in released this statement, this public statement to the media, to the news, and they said, quote, "Students kneeling during the national anthem are just expressing their rights protected by the First Amendment. Our public schools support students' rights to free speech." Now, contrast that to what happened with Coach Joe Kennedy. Now, ever since 2008, Joe Kennedy has been going to the 50-yard line and taking a knee and offering a brief prayer, a prayer of thanksgiving. And his prayer would last just for about 30 seconds. And during that time, there was no proselytizing, there was no recruiting. He would just go and pray really quickly, and that was that. He said he was inspired to do this by watching the movie Facing the Giants. Now, eventually this caught on, and many of the students were inspired by this. And so one by one, many of the students voluntarily started to join him at the 50-yard line and pray with him. That is until September of last year, September of 2017. When all of a sudden Joe Kennedy was suspended and then eventually fired by the school district. And they said, quote, he was fired for public religious displays on the football field while on duty as a coach. Now, by the way, we should mention one other football coach at this time. There was another football coach in the exact same school district by the name of David Boutan. Now, Boutan would also pray, but he was a Buddhist. He would go to the 50-yard line after the game, and he would also pray, but his prayers were Buddhist chants. And yet, he was never suspended, he was never reprimanded, he was never dismissed because of his religious displays. It was the Christian coach that was targeted. It was the Christian coach that they made an example of. And so later, when Coach Kennedy was asked if he had any regrets, he said no. He says, if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't do anything differently. He says, I've always taught my guys to stand up for what they believe, even if it's not popular, no matter what the costs. And he lived it. He practiced what he preached. I'm also encouraged by the seniors, the graduating seniors at East Liverpool High School in East Liverpool, Ohio. Because what they did during their graduation ceremony ended up making national headlines. Now listen, a few weeks before their graduation ceremony, they were told by the school district that they would not be allowed to sing the Lord's Prayer. Now you have to understand that in this particular school, the the graduation tradition of this school for the past 70 years was that every class would always sing the Lord's Prayer. That had been the tradition of this school for the last 7 decades. And so after 70 years, now the school district is telling them that they can't do it. Because the Freedom from Religion Foundation complained that this was a violation of the U.S. Constitution, that this was promoting religion. And so the school district told them that they had to cease and desist, that they couldn't do it. Well, a few minutes before graduation, some of the students were talking about this long-time tradition of theirs and how it was now outlawed. And as one senior put it, he said, we thought it was wrong that we were being forced to remove it. And so, after the valedictorian welcomed everybody and thanked everybody for coming, suddenly the entire senior class stood to their feet and they began committing an act of civil disobedience when in unison they said, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And they recited verbatim the entire Lord's Prayer. And when asked about it later by the news, by the media, one graduate said this. He said, well, technically, we didn't break any rules because we were told not to sing the Lord's Prayer. They didn't say anything about reciting it. And this encourages me. Do you remember what Jesus said? In the context of persecution, here's what Jesus said. Jesus, in Luke chapter 12, verses 8 and 9 said, "I say to you, whoever confesses me before men, him the Son of Man will also confess before the angels of God. But he who denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God." And listen, that was in the context of persecution, because it was in the same context that Jesus said that in those days they will drag you off to the magistrates. In other words, they will drag you into court. They will sue you. And he says they will attack you and they will persecute you. Some of them will even kill you because of me. And then in that context he says, but whoever stands and confesses me before men, I will stand and confess him before heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will deny him before heaven. Listen to me. In the days in which you and I live, in the days where we live, where Christians are being targeted, just like the Apostle Paul was being targeted, the question is, are we going to stand just like the Apostle Paul stood? Because listen, first they came for the Christian florist. Then they came for the Christian football coach. Then they came for the Christian mom who's putting Bible verses in her son's sack lunch. And one day, they might come for you. And when they do, will you stand or will you fall? Jesus said, whoever stands and confesses me, I will stand and confess them. Amen.